Rightio, is everybody suitably refreshed and ready to go? Hmm. Mr. Parker, you were going to take us through noise next.
Yes, thank you, sir. So I have 2 points on policy HL3, and I can be relatively speedy. The first one, and I make it simply as a matter of record, is to repeat the concern in respect to the reference to the COCP. Again, in light of Mr. McNichol's last answer, which is that the intention of the policy is to set the policy requirements which can then be complied through compliance with the guidance in the COCP. Frankly, just I don't see why then incorporation of explicit reference to the COCP within the policy itself would be objectionable. And again, we say would provide certainty and transparency so far as reasonable without unduly restricting flexibility. So I'll repeat my submissions that I made in respect to policy HL2, in respect of HL3 so far as the COCP is concerned. The second point, you'll have to beg my indulgence because I suspect I know, and the association knows what the answer will be, but the most significant concern that residents have about construction activities in the city so far as noise is concerned relate to working hours, and in particular working on weekends. At the moment, construction activities are in general permitted on Saturdays, and that is the cause of significant consternation on the part of residents, clearly because they are, for the most part, in their homes on the weekend in a way in which they aren't necessarily during the week. A number of other local authorities have restricted construction activities and to limit weekend working, particularly to Saturday morning. And we would ask the city to consider an explicit policy or reference in the reason justification to working hours to restrict Saturday working. As I say, I suspect I know what those opposed to that proposal will say, or concerned about the relevance it is to your job at this examination. All I would say in response to that is there are a number of policies which in the plan which are highly specific, and the example which Ms. Smith alights on is a policy relating to on-street shredding. So it is not as though this is a plan which does not descend into quite detailed matters when it considers it appropriate to do so. We say that by comparison to the impact of construction activities on residents, on-street shedding is really a rather minor issue, and that if you're going to descend to that level of detail in relation to a matter such as shredding, it's appropriate to descend to the level of detail in respect of construction working hours. It's right to say that working hours are in the COCP, and so in some respects this reflects the concern that I've expressed about referencing the COCP within the body of the policy. But yes, the second point is that we would request and say that the plan isn't sound unless it adequately protects residential amenity through additional restrictions on Saturday working. If I may briefly follow that up with, I understand, I'm told that the city are working on an updated version of the COCP. I'm not quite sure what stage that has reached. I understand that the intention will be for the city to consult on a draft of that document, and obviously it would be open to the association and others to make representations as part of that. But we say that this is a significant enough issue to residents to justify consideration here as part of the production of this plan.
Mr. McNeil.
Thank you very much. Sorry, just to go on the detour of shredding whilst we're discussing that, that's a quite specific policy, and it's I recognise the point that on-street shredding isn't a particular issue. There was a particular challenge when we were drafting the policy around it, and it seems to have largely gone away, fortunately. But that is in policy VT2, and is a case that it applies everywhere. You know, it's a case, it's a situation where on-street shredding is really quite very significant disturbance, and it disturbs everyone all of the time. I think construction plans and the timing of those will depend very much on where you are in the city and their impact. The Code of Practice for Deconstruction and Construction does talk at length about working hours, does go into that quite extensively, and I think it's the right place for us to look at that level of detail, given the flexibility that you need on individual sites. Sites might come forward very close to residential areas and therefore need to have more restrictions on them than would otherwise the case. They might come forward away from residential areas, but with through traffic that comes via residential areas or that needs to be rerouted away from. So there isn't a kind of one size fits all rule that we can easily put into the plan. And I think that it's right for us to have that level of detail within the construction code of practice itself, rather than necessarily bringing that into the wording of the policy as is being suggested here. Thank you.
First.
Thank you. So still on question 2 and looking at noise in particular, we question the aspiration of this policy set, and we've talked about air quality already, but let's talk about noise now. We think the evidence and the local context demand a more ambitious and less discriminatory approach. We draw your attention to the city's evidence, which, although it's got a more up-to-date number on the front of the noise documents that you've got, actually, when you go and have a look at them, the underlying data comes from 2009, which is the last time that the city actually bothered to look at noise. So what I'm going to look at here is the health impact assessment for the city plan, which says the city performs significantly worse than the rest of London when it comes to environmental factors such as noise exposure and air pollution. Nearly a third of the resident population experience noise of 65 decibels or higher during the day and 55 decibels or higher during the night. The London averages are significantly lower. So all the policies so far, and this is broadly a continuation of existing policies, have not resulted in a level of noise in the city which is acceptable. We also take the view that evidence and local context support policies now which help meet the World Health Organization guidelines, and they looked at urban noise, and their guidelines are 53 decibels, which is an adjusted 24-hour average, and 45 decibels, which is a nighttime average. So you can see that we're 10 decibels above the adjusted nighttime average. So what that means is that city residents aren't even getting the respite at night that you would expect to get. Saturday construction in the city has a disproportionate effect on the residential population. There are very few city workers who are at their desks on Saturdays. So this exposes city residents to noise nuisance and the smallest and most deadly 2.5 PM particulates that damage health in a discriminatory fashion, especially as residents are much more likely to be in the vulnerable groups, such as children and old people, than the working population is. We have provided in our Reg 19 an alternative to S1 6A, which should say, quote, do no demolition, deconstruction or construction on Saturday mornings in residential areas, comma, and engage with neighbours before and during construction to minimise adverse impacts and mitigate any residual adverse impacts.
Sorry, could you just repeat that for me?
Yeah. Do no demolition, comma, deconstruction or construction on Saturday mornings in residential areas, which addresses Rob's point, comma, and engage with neighbours before and during construction to minimise adverse impacts and mitigate any residual adverse impacts. End quote. Yeah.
So
I've got other things to talk about on a different topic. But,
just help me. Help me here. So at the moment, near residential areas, you're saying that construction is taking place on Saturday mornings in the city.
Yeah.
But then it sort of stops, say 1 o'clock, is it?
It currently stops at 1 o'clock.
1 o'clock, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, that text could take out mornings. I mean, that was written for the current context.
Okay, carry on.
I should say that there are examples of developments going on at the moment where, for reasons where the developers have decided that they don't want to work on Saturday mornings, and it hasn't affected the viability of the scheme at all, not being able to work on a Saturday morning.
Is there anything in the policy? So I'm looking at policy HL3 noise and vibration from deconstruction and construction activities must be minimised. Mitigation measures put in place to limit noise disturbance near development. Developers will need to demonstrate that we know increase in background noise levels associated with new plant and equipment. Is there anything in that policy that would stop you making a representation to say that actually, given the proximity, say for example, the proximity of a scheme to the Barbican or Golden Lane is going to have an adverse impact at the weekend, and therefore we, like the council, the corporation, to exercise their judgment in granting consent? Would that policy prohibit that, or is it?
Well, I think I think the reality of life in the city is that if we're leaving this to that stage of the process, it simply isn't going to happen. And I think we're saying that the evidence of the background levels of noise that we currently experience in the city, you can hear them now already, mean that this should be a policy matter and not just left to individual planning applications.
Mr. Parker?
Thank you, sir. Very briefly, just to echo what Ms. Hurst said, I appreciate the question, is there anything in the plan that would stop this happening? But of course, to be sound, it's not simply a question of whether the plan would stop something happening, because one of the aspects of soundness is the policy effective by reference to the evidence base? And if the evidence base suggests that more policy protection is needed to achieve the objective which the policy sets out to achieve, then the question is not whether the plan would prevent something from happening, but that does the plan go far enough to deliver upon the objective which it has set for itself? So in my submission, Miss House's point and the points that we made about working and construction activities, in my submission, don't simply depend on asking oneself the question whether what we're saying can be accommodated within the plan.
Using the argument you sort of use with regard to pollution about either you list everything or you just use a sort of a broad term to encapsulate everything that everybody understands, does that not apply to point 3 of policy HL3 that sets out that developers should minimise, and then obviously that there's no increase in background with regards to plant and machinery? Does that not provide the decision maker with a clear direction? Is it not clear? And does that not allow then obviously because obviously we're not here to consider every proposal before us, are we? It's a tool for decision makers. Is that not clear enough? I know I heard you say no, but
the code of construction says that that allows, it gives the hours of working, they include Saturday. Going back to that discussion about how transparent are the rules so everybody knows, because they're there, the city will not accept representations that they shouldn't be working on Saturday because the code says there should be. So it's not it's not the plan that stops us, it's the code.
so you're saying the plan in itself is fine, but it's the application of the code which isn't before me or Mr. Phillips. Is that right? Okay.
So the only other point I was going to make is it's not a one size all fits approach. The point that was made in respect of pollutants is that there are a range of specific pollutants, some of which were mentioned in the policy, some of which weren't. There's no particular hierarchy to any of those pollutants. We say it was wrong to mention some, not the others. Here, the point is different, which is that there is a very specific concern about working hours, which we say justifies reflection in the plan. That wouldn't dilute the requirement to minimise and otherwise mitigate construction impact, but it's a very specific concern which has long plagued residents and we say justifies inclusion within the plan. So it wouldn't otherwise restrict the general application of policy HL3. And you're right to say that there is nothing in HL3 that would prevent a condition being imposed on a planning permission to restrict Saturday working to minimise noise. But the question is a different one here. We say, is it effective to achieve its aims? And we say it wouldn't be effective unless it included that specific provision.
I think I saw it. Is on just because I'm not from around these parts. I live in the country area. So is on street shredding where they do, like, is it a lorry that shreds cardboard basically noisily with a large machine?
Yeah.
Like we have people who cut down our hedges and use the, yeah, that's yeah, okay. Right. So in the on-street shredding, which is the policy VT2, the city corporation used an example, didn't you, in terms of hours of operation? Is it in the VT2 the transport? Let me just find it. Use an example, didn't you? You said for IE. Isn't that right? What page? Thank you.
Specific hours.
Well, it's an example, isn't it, rather than specific hours, isn't it? It just says that delivery and servicing development must take place outside people. Oh, i.e. no deliveries. All right. I have some sympathy people that live in the square mile, in that I do think there may be an argument. I'm not suggesting that the policy needs to be changed per se, but I'm wondering whether there could be an accommodation through an additional modification. I don't think it's necessary for soundness, where the corporation could potentially consider putting something in along the lines of examples may mean where construction or deconstruction may have an impact on residential, residential amenity. There may be circumstances where to ensure necessary respite. I'm thinking about this off the hoof, so it's not policy worded. That, consideration should be given to whether Saturday morning working is appropriate but it would only be on site specific circumstances, which would give you potentially a hook and a barb. I don't think it needs to be incorporated in the policy per se, but it would give a hook and a barb and actually as a gentle nudge to the decision maker, just to be aware that where development does have an impact on residential amenity, then it just needs that just a little bit of extra care, thought and attention rather than a one size fits all. I don't think that would be overly problematic for the corporation. And it might be that, for example, in a construction management plan, it might be just for certain periods. So you wouldn't necessarily, it might just be for the noisy phase of construction. And actually, I've noticed from the policy, you're talking about obligations as well. So it could be fit the circumstances of the proposal. And it's just a little hook and a barb for the decision maker. Just a thought. Mr. McNichol, just any thoughts on that?
I actually wonder, sorry.
As Mr. McNichol said at the beginning of this debate, the noise comes from, things like demolition and so on, but it also comes from transport logistics. And while you might think there's a noisy phase and a not noisy phase, actually fit out, which is considered not noisy, when you're talking about these massive buildings, the number of lorries coming in and out at fit out is way bigger than you would expect in most developments, and certainly way bigger than you get at the demolition phase. So actually all of the construction have the potential to be noisy.
And that's why there's a problem with having a hard and fast policy, and that's why it's important just to be very careful how it's just raising that cognizance of the effect of construction and deconstruction on residential.
Yes, I don't want to interrupt Mr. McNichol. I think that would be very gratefully welcomed. Some indication that in residential areas, cognizance of the effects on residential community, particularly Saturday working, would be very welcome without necessarily being unduly restrictive. So I think that would be very welcome in principle. But yeah, without that reference then being unduly specific. And then at least if there is a hook for the decision maker in deciding what's appropriate by way of the construction management plan or whatever particular document is used to guide development, that there is then that consideration that's at least given to the issue before any construction management plans are approved.
Wouldn't necessarily rule out Saturday morning working. It would just mean that it would be part of the decision maker's consideration. And I think potentially, it's just throwing it out there, Mr. McNichol.
I do wonder whether it might be fruitful to hear from the City Property Association, because I suspect they may have comments on this specific matter. And Reverend Jorgensen, I understand you've also got your Toblerone up as well. But that might just be helpful for the conversation.
Jorgensen first, and then CPA.
Just briefly to underline again that Portsoken is not residents are not represented here, because this is not the sort of the format of something that they're likely to have been involved with. It doesn't mean they don't feel it really deeply. So Middlesex Street estate, I know, has had issues around buildings back-to-back consecutive buildings, so just one finishes, another one starts, and the noise is just continuous over a number of years. So anything that can be done to help resolve that would be really brilliant. Thank you.
Mr. Randall.
Thank you, sir. This isn't a specific topic we raised in our written submissions. Obviously, I've heard the debate and have sympathy with residents. I think we would be very concerned, though, if through this debate there was a change in the well-established hours of working for Saturday. This is a principle that's not only unique to the City Corporation. It is an established principle nationally. Standard working hours on a Saturday are 9 till 1. The City have bespoke hours which are 8 till 1. The City have bespoke hours 9 till 2. And if there's any suggestion of a variance to those, then that should be the subject of fuller consultation, and the CPA would absolutely want to make detailed representations. I don't see there's an issue of soundness here for you, sir, and I'd say would be concerned if there was any sort of unilateral change to those working hours.
No, I fully accept that there's a sort of a national norm for Saturday morning working in the construction industry. For somebody who was young and could climb up ladders, I made a lot of money on a Saturday morning tiling roofs. So it was yeah, I absolutely appreciate that. But it's just to flag. I'm not suggesting any sort of off the hoof change to the policies. Just to raise an awareness to the impact of proposals. Now, obviously, there may be instances where Saturday morning, even though it is the norm, there may be instances across the country where Saturday morning working is not found acceptable. So it's just about flagging it rather than setting anything hard and fast, in my view. But I don't think it goes to a matter of soundness per se, but I think obviously it's just providing a bit more direction of the decision maker and making sure that cognizance of the potential of impacts on residents is considered. Mr. McNichol.
Thank you. I mean, I think our feeling is that this is something that is best dealt with through construction logistics plans themselves, that they are quite extensive detailed documents that can really look at sites within their specific context and understand if there are particular challenges in terms of noise impacts and so on. We have the Code of Practice for Construction Deconstruction. It does set out a range of different approaches and some flexibilities within that. But I would be slightly concerned about adopting a local plan that says something that feels to me like it's slightly at odds with what our code of practice states. We are looking to review the construction code of practice. That will be consulted on. I think that's the place to go into what we expect to see in terms of the hours of operation. You know, it's a 66-page document. It's pretty comprehensive. I don't think it's baggy. I think it's got a lot in it that's really valuable. That to me feels like the proper place to be looking at hours of operation and exploring this issue in a bit more detail.
Mr. Parker.
Thanks. Just briefly to come back on a couple of points made by Mr. Randall. As I understand it, and you've made clear, but just to reiterate, no one's suggesting unilaterally, as it were, imposing working hours restrictions as a matter of policy in the plan. But it's right also to note that other London boroughs, particularly RBKC, for example, have, as a matter of policy, restricted construction activities on Saturdays. So it's not as though there is some national norm which would mean that a restriction on Saturday working would not be justified. See another London borough right in the CAS with similar issues affecting it as the city corporation. So that kind of approach can probably be justified and has probably been justified. I think all I would say is to reiterate that we would very much welcome the suggestion that you've made. This is a very important point to the association. Residential amenity is one of the main reasons why we're here. I just want to highlight that to yourself and Mr. McNichol, and to welcome some recognition, even within the reason justification for the policy, that consideration be given to the issue without imposing any explicit restriction.
Hurst. I think I've heard all I need to hear. Obviously, I've been very clear. I don't think that any modification would be necessary for soundness. I've heard what you've said. I think when I've read and reread the policies, residential is identified as a noise sensitive type of development. It's very clear in the policy that, you know, potential noise conflict between existing activities and new development should be minimised in line with the agent of change principle. Noise and vibration should, you know, so it's clearly signposted there. Again, how the policy works, obviously you've got this constructors code, so it directs you to that constructors code, which is pretty common. The corporation saying they're reviewing that's not a matter before myself and Mr. Phillips, but obviously there. It's very clear that the use of planning conditions and obligations will be considered where this could successfully moderate adverse effects by limiting hours of operation. Then obviously the others are, you know, so I think the policy covers it all. I think it's just that direct, you know, whether the council, whether the corporation feels it could just do a little bit more to highlight impacts on residential rather than, but I think we're, you know, it does cover it all. And obviously I know that other London boroughs have different approaches, but we're in the City of London, and we, from day one, we've said that the city is unique, isn't it? And in terms of the balance, and obviously, but that doesn't mean that people in residential areas should, you know, be adversely impacted. But really, I think the key is to make those points on a site by site basis in terms of there. And I think there's enough hooks and barbs already in the policy to make those points and make those arguments about, for example, Saturday morning working. And then obviously for the local authority, to reach a view on those in the planning application stage. Sorry, Mr. Peacock.
Thanks, sir. I was going to move on to a different point around public toilets.
Would you just bear with me, because Mr. Parker's just got to do play, and then we'll come to public toilets. Okay.
I can be very much more brief. The position of the association in respect of, so it's policy HL7 in relation to sport and recreation, and then policy HL8, the same principle underlying what we want to say. So policy HR7 criterion 3 makes reference to the need for new facilities not to cause undue disturbance to neighbouring occupiers. And as set out in our Reg 19 representations, we ask you to consider a slight amendment to that wording to make specific, rather than use the phrase undue disturbance, should not harm residential amenity or cause nuisance to neighbouring occupiers. So again, it's a point about residential amenity. We acknowledge that policy HL7 makes reference to disturbance to neighbours, and we ask you to consider a slight variation to the wording to protect residential amenity. Policy HL8 does not make any reference to residential amenity or undue disturbance at all. The association is supportive of the motivation for the policy, which is to deliver play areas and facilities. That's not in question. But similarly to policy HL7, we consider that policy HL8 should make reference to potential impacts on residential amenity, because play areas similarly can have potential effects on residential amenity, as do areas for sport and recreation, and that the plan should make provision for consideration to be given to that issue in determining the merits of any proposals that come forward by reference to that policy.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think, first of all, perhaps a bit of a broken record here, but must emphasise that the plan does need to be read as a whole, that there are other policies that seek to make sure that any development, and that would include new developments of play space or sports and recreation facilities, have an acceptable impact on residential amenity. I think there's the wording specifically in HL7, new facilities should provide flexible space and should not cause undue disturbance in neighbouring occupiers. I think there's always a tension in writing policy, and we need to make sure that we're taking the right approach here. I think there's, the word undue is doing quite a lot of the lifting on this. I think we need to recognise that for some people, any disturbance might be too much disturbance, and we need to just make it clear that there is a level of acceptability and otherwise when it comes to things like sports and recreation, particularly, which of course are often, do have a noisy impact. But the policy is there to ensure that they are not causing undue disturbance to neighbouring occupiers. Play areas and facilities equally, I think, are spaces that inevitably, particularly when they're designed for children, they are going to be spaces that are causing noise. And I think I'd hope that nobody wants to stop that from occurring, to stop the noise from happening. But I can understand the appeal for a consistent approach here. And I think if there's something that we can do to perhaps add a line to how the policy works for the play areas and facilities policy in terms of disturbance, and then I think that's something that we could certainly consider. There are, I think it's important though that we make sure that we aren't undermining our ability to deliver new play spaces within the square mile, particularly as the places that we need, the places that there's more likely to be demand for play spaces is going to be in existing or new residential development. So I think there's a tension there, but I think we could look at a form of words within part 3.9 effectively of the policy, of the supporting text, sorry.
Well, just very briefly, I'm sure that would be welcomed by the association. And just to be absolutely clear, the points in relation to policy HL8 would not, the wording that we're seeking to introduce would not look to restrict the corporation's ability to deliver the facilities promoted by the policy. It's just a question of the way, you know, maybe it's precise location, maybe it's the way in which those facilities come forward. It's a delivery of those facilities and a requirement that regard be had to the potential impacts on residential community in the way that they're designed. So, yeah.
Yeah, I don't think there's any need for soundness reasons for modifications for those two policies. I think the first one is that if you have sports and recreation facilities, if you ever heard me play football many years ago, I wasn't the quietest. There again, you probably believe that. But you know, I wasn't playing till 2-3 o'clock in the morning. You know, I was playing till sort of 10 o'clock at night when the sort of floodlights went out. I also know the benefits of these facilities bring to communities, in terms of giving children and young adults alternatives to sort of an opportunities to do something else other than sort of hang around in street corners or potentially churchyards. And I think obviously if we're talking about health and inclusivity as well, it's obviously good to get people, all areas of the community out exercising and using sports facilities. So I think undue disturbance to neighbouring occupiers. I think there is, with anything, there is a degree of noise. With regard to the play areas, I thought that the final line of paragraph 3.90 is an important component ensuring communities can be active, healthy, and have fun where they live. And given that play areas are predominantly for children, although you'll see the occasional adult going down the slide in a shopping trolley, I think on the whole it is for younger children, these play areas, and I wouldn't want to put, I don't think there's any don't need. I can understand as well that noise from these can be irritating at times, but I think we were all young once, weren't we? We all needed to let off steam, and given how it's been explained to us as visitors to this city, in terms of how compact and how dense it is, I think opportunities to provide those and not unduly restrict them is I think the corporation in terms of those policies has got the balance right in my view. I don't think there's any modifications needed for soundness or any further clarifications. Mr. Peacock, do you want to talk about toilets now?
Thank you, sir. I would love to.
Just bear with me. Just need to calm myself.
Two very brief points. One on public toilets, and if I might just backtrack on the city plan's definition of quiet places and spaces very briefly, I'd be grateful. So HL6 on public toilets supports the increased membership of public toilets scheme, CTS, but under 3.7.2, how the policy works, this is framed around provision within major developments, and we would argue it misses the opportunity to use existing public toilets. So 30 of the city churches have public toilets, of which 14 are fully accessible. for wheelchair users. Not all are open every day, but many could be with the right agreements in place. So we'd suggest an additional point under how the policy works, 3.7.5, that the City Corporation will seek to expand membership of the CTS through putting appropriate agreements in place with existing toilet providers, such as churches and other community and cultural providers. So again, this point doesn't stop churches providing this service, but unless it's mentioned, we continually have conversations with corporation bodies like Destination City and the cultural department, who are surprised that churches provide toilets. So mentioning this specifically could also save the corporation some money about building new toilets. Shall I pause there? There's just one additional point.
Just carry on.
Okay. So just going back to strategic policy S1, in the context of health and inclusion, respecting the city's quieter places and spaces is quoted. But in 3.1.6, there is a leap to this being about tranquility and quieter areas in outdoor spaces and the public realm. So that ignores quiet indoor spaces, libraries, places of worship, which seems like a semantic point. But if you're going to the trouble of being very specific about quiet spaces being outdoor spaces in public realm, it seems sensible to include indoor spaces. So we would suggest an additional point, 3.1.8, that reflects the and acknowledges the need for quiet spaces, including churches and other spaces, to offer very important provision for mental health, reflection and support, which we have talked at length about earlier.
Mr. Randall?
Thank you, sir. I actually had a follow-up then on HL6 Part 2, public toilets. CPA are in principle supportive of this policy, but I just wanted to draw you to our written submissions in respect of some concerns around requirement for availability 24 hours. We do think that potentially causes some issues around building management, and feel that the provision of toilets should be better aligned to normal working hours, such that these facilities can be properly maintained, managed through the working week.
Mr. McNichol?
Thank you very much. I'll talk about quiet spaces first of all, before we get into public toilets. I think I understand the point being made here that churches and other spaces within the city, indoor spaces, do provide access to quiet spaces. There are a range of them. I think that's a factual issue that we can recognise within the supporting text of the plan itself. I don't think that significantly alters the approach that we would be taking. But certainly not a main modification, and not something that I would consider a matter of soundness in any sense. On public toilets, I think that the community toilet scheme is a separate scheme that's not part of the city plan per se. We reference it and we certainly encourage membership of it. I understand that the City Corporation is looking at public toilets as a whole across the square mile to understand, public toilets and other toilets that are available to members of the public, I should say, to understand how we can ensure that the delivery of that really important service is enhanced. And I'd be more than happy to speak to colleagues who are working on that to ensure that they recognise the role that churches have in providing facilities for a whole range of people, many of which are accessible and are open many hours as well. The point on 24-hour operation, which Mr. Randall raises, I think we are ambitious in this plan. We do try to, we know and recognise that public toilets are a really key facility, and there are challenges around funding for public toilets generally, and we've seen their depletion happen quite substantially, not just in the city but also more broadly across London. They're an absolutely vital resource for a whole range of different individuals and groups who need to have access to them and need more of their more public toilets to be able to enjoy the city. And as the city becomes somewhere that more and more people are coming to, we need to make sure that they are accessible. They're also important to have overnight as well as to have during the day. Having said that, I do recognise that in some instances where a building is providing public toilets that they perhaps wouldn't otherwise necessarily have to provide in accordance with the policy, that's an over and above an additionality. And therefore requiring the operation of that 24 hours perhaps could be something that wouldn't be something that's achievable practically. I'd be very loath for us to water down the policy in any meaningful sense here, but perhaps there's a small tweak that could be made to recognise the need for flexibility in some instances of the delivery of this. But we do want to remain ambitious to make the city somewhere that people have access to these really vital facilities at all times of day and all times of the week. Thank you.
I think I draw comfort from the word should rather than must. So it does give that little bit of flexibility. If you read many inspectors' decisions, not that I suggest you do, because you'll fall into a deep coma very, very quickly, but should, could, and would are probably three of the most used words in our decisions and our reports. It's it's not definitive. It's a clear direction. But obviously there may be circumstances. And I was thinking, well, what are the unintended consequences of not having 24-hour toilets? And obviously that places a burden in terms of street cleaning. It has an impact on, so I think there's that sort of that balance, isn't there? But it's not definitive. It's not saying you must. It says it should. So I think that gives for CPA and its members, it gives that opportunity to say, look, it's not practicable. We're sort of factored until 11 o'clock at night, so we'll close the toilets at 10:30 or something like that, but we're open again at 6 in the morning. So I think it gives you the opportunity to make that argument or make that case. Mr. Parker.
Very briefly to reiterate that, it's also clear from criterion, what we would strongly support retaining the policy in its current form, including by reference to 24 hours a day. It's not only street cleaning that, what are the unintended consequences? It's residential amenity.
Yeah.
It is another potential unintended consequence. It's not only the reference to the word should, but it's also what follows, particularly in areas with concentrations of nighttime activity. So the policy itself makes clear that the focus for its attention is areas of nighttime activity. And it may well be that in an area of nighttime activity, an office might be expected to keep its toilets open 24 hours, whereas in an area that's not got any nighttime activity, that wouldn't be appropriate. So there's flexibility built into the policy, but certainly it should be aspirational, given all set out in our representations, the current paucity of facilities and the need for an ambitious policy to address what is a clear issue in the city, we say.
Ms. Hurst?
Similar point. We support the policy as is. We think the ambition is right. In fact, we said we would like to see it go further, and that the community toilet scheme membership should be a requirement for any development next to open space, because those open spaces encourage an awful lot of visitors, and they also become a focal point for nighttime urination, which is definitely a problem in the city.
Okay. So I think we've probably covered this question, but I'll ask it anyway and just allow the council to answer it formally. But are the policies clearly defined and unambiguous so that it's evident how a decision maker should react to development proposals? We have touched on this quite extensively, so no need to. Oh, Mr. Randall.
So I was just going to make one minor point under this question. In relation to health impact assessments, HL9, equality of impact assessments, HL1. CPA supports the principles of those. It was a minor point in reference to the thresholds for those, which talks about major. And you might remember, sir, I raised this previously in week 1. I think it would be better to define that by reference to 1,000 square metre uplift. A major would potentially catch change of use applications or smaller proposals for a larger building with an extension of 500 square metres, for example. So we just thought it'd be useful to provide some additional clarity around what is meant by major and certainly clarify that in relation to an uplift rather than a broad major definition.
That'd be consistent with our discussions when we met in week 1. Yeah. So the definition would be the same as you agreed in week 1. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, Mr. Russell.
Right, yes, the policies are clearly defined and unambiguous and are in accordance with MPPF paragraph 16, which requires clearly written and unambiguous policies, which are drafted so that it is evident how decision makers should react to the development proposals. The policies are worded positively and clearly demonstrate what is required from the applicant in order to progress the application. Policy HL1 seeks design and access statements at an early stage for developments. Statements are expected to demonstrate a commitment to inclusive design and the promotion of equity, diversity and social inclusion. HL2 seeks air quality assessments to align with the air quality SPD, while HL3 seeks noise impact assessments to align with the noise SPD, and HL9 requires health impact assessments of varying levels of detail for developments depending on their size. The policies are clear where thresholds and viability considerations apply, and the policies clearly separate policy from supporting text, which is divided into the reason for the policy and how the policy works for maximum clarity.
Does anybody have anything else they wish to raise?
Only to say we don't necessarily agree, but I've made all the points that we want to make by reference to the second question, so I'm not going to repeat myself.
Okay. Same as have you? Yeah.
Three small points. I'll be quick. One of them may have been made under question 2. I'm not sure. So that is a plea for defibrillators. The 2036 draft city plan had defibrillators to be accessed 24/7, a bit like toilets, but that's been taken out of this this draft plan. We question the evidence for removing the policy, given the high number and concentration of workers, residents and visitors in the city, and we've provided you with supporting documentation. So we propose that 24/7 public access defibrillators are restated because it will extend health and wellbeing provision. Shall I just go on to the other stuff, or do you want to reply on defibrillators?
Yeah, so I believe we've mentioned defibrillators in our infrastructure delivery plan and set out some evidence about their provision across city corporation sites. I think there are 43 different defibrillators that we have, and that Central London does have a really strong proliferation of defibrillators right across the city. I recognise the need for them. You know, they're a really vital tool for tackling really acute health crises and are very valuable in delivering absolutely life-saving healthcare. I slightly worry about including them in a city plan, quite a strategic document, given the complexities around the need for access to them, around how that gets delivered and monitored specifically. It's certainly something I'd like us to explore further, though, as we take forward supplementary planning guidance. We have guidance coming forward on inclusion and well-being, which I think will be a useful place for us to have a look at this in detail. But I'd be slightly wary of introducing a policy in the plan at this late stage to require the provision of defibrillators.
Why was it taken out the earlier? Just as a
I think I'd have to take that away and check, I'm afraid. I don't have an immediate answer for you.
And your second point, Sister.
Okay, so this goes to being unambiguous. The context for strategic policy S1 is the City of London Joint Health and Wellbeing Strategy, and it says it's implementing the principles of that. There's been an updated version of it. It doesn't have any principles. It does say that it's got some priorities, financial resilience in the light of poverty amongst local residents, reducing social isolation with residents over 65 in Cripplegate, which is where our key area change is, at high risk of loneliness. And the third is improving mental health, which we've already heard about. It isn't immediately apparent how the policies that have then been put under this strategic objective meet with that. I understand the nesting and the having another document and so on, but I just don't think that that really reflects what it is this plan is trying to achieve here. And then my final point on this, which is another policy altogether, is under HL5, it talks about protecting existing social and community facilities, and a lot of what the churches had to say reflected this. But of course, this is where an awful lot of the health stuff is, and we say that should be protect and improve existing community facilities in situ in order to meet the London plan and all the rest of it. It's me done.
I'm so sorry. Could I just ask you to repeat that second point in relation to HL5 and the protection of existing facilities?
Yeah. And as an aside, we'd also say that not all identified need can be met by flexible multi-user space.
Is that not covered in S112, which says protecting and enhancing existing community facilities, allowing for relocation where justified, providing new facilities where required, and so if you go back to S1, that enhance? Is that not? Does that not?
The whole point is that if it's in the strategic policy, shouldn't it be in the?
It doesn't necessarily need to repeat, though, does it?
No, and I think that's the approach we've taken in drafting. Is I think it's worthwhile looking at S1 and also looking at Part 7 of that policy, protecting and enhancing existing public health and education facilities. Part 8, encouraging the further provision of both public and private health facilities. And then 10, supporting facilities for the provision and improvement of social and education services through the city's libraries, supporting additional childcare facilities, protecting and enhancing existing community facilities. So I think there's quite a lot in S1 that is, that the strategic policies are not simply a sort of overarching nebulous concept. They are policies that will be applied to applications to development, and then the non-strategic policies take those parts that need further unpacking to expand on that. And HL5 does that through exploring the issue of, which is often quite an acute issue, of how we protect existing social facilities and what new development of social and community facilities should be designed to achieve. So the two working in concert, the two to go hand in hand.
Does anybody else need to say anything on health, inclusion and safety? I think I've heard all I need to hear. I've got all your statements. It's been really helpful to us both this morning and the early part of the afternoon. So it's 1:05. Do you want to take a break for lunch? I think you would, wouldn't you? So right. How long do you want for lunch? Should we say an hour? Should we say half an hour? Half an hour? I think it probably takes 10 minutes to leave the building and get back in. So if you say half an hour, we're not going to. If people want to get a bite to eat, I think you're going to struggle. So you be back here for 2:00. Thank you. For all those who are leaving, thank you for this morning. It's been very helpful. For those who aren't, you'll have to suffer us both this afternoon. See you both at 2:00. Teamwork makes the dream work, eh? Yeah. Good afternoon. It's 2 o'clock and it's time to reopen this examination into the City of London plan. Okay. Hope you all had a nice lunch and were able to stretch your legs and enjoy the sunshine. We're now going to turn to main matter 11, which is the section safe and secure city. And that falls under the health, inclusion and safety section of the plan. You can see that on page 38. It deals with strategic policy S2, then policies SA1 to SA3. So are the requirements for a safe and secure city as set out in policies S2 and SA1 to SA3 justified by appropriate available evidence having regard to national guidance and local context, and are they in general conformity with the London plan?
Yes, the requirements of the city plan policies relating to safety and security are justified by appropriate evidence and have regard to national guidance, local context and London plan policies. The City of London has an increased threat of incidents affecting the safety of residents, visitors and buildings potentially due to the presence of high-profile international organisations and large numbers of people coming to work in the city and visit attractions. The policies on safety and security align with the NPPF and the London Plan by ensuring early engagement with applicants, appropriate design solutions and good management structures. Policy S2 is the overarching strategic policy with a vision to ensure that the city is safe and secure, with the implementation of the vision achieved through policies SA1 to SA3. Policy SA3 advises that security measures must be incorporated into the design of development at an early stage and take account of secured by design principles. Hostile vehicle mitigation measures are also sought in the design of buildings and the public realm. Policy SA2 states that major commercial development and nighttime developments must produce a management statement that sets out detailed proposals for the dispersal of patrons and workers from premises to ensure the safe egress of all people and minimise the potential for overcrowding. Policy SA2 also ensures that development proposals take account of the need for resilience so that residential and business communities are prepared for emergencies such as fire, flood and weather hazards and are able to recover quickly.
Does anybody have any comments on this policy? Speaker.
This is the question one of that of matter 11. Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you. There's a couple of points here, relatively brief. We'd like to make a point around, I guess, the sort of human side of prevention in the safety of the city, in terms of a safe environment and the importance of other strands of multi-agency and multi-partner working, some of which is brought out, but not fully in our opinion. So we'd like the inspectors to consider adding an additional point in S2 or 3.11.4 in under how it works to reflect the role of charities, third sector organisations, statutory provision, and in fact developers themselves in working together across sectors to support the safety of the city's population. One example is the Nighttime Safety Hub, which was a multi-agency endeavour intervention with the City of London Corporation, the police, NHS, St John's Ambulance, EC Bid, victim support, all housed in one of the churches, St Botolph's at Bishopsgate. So this multi-agency working is about more of the sort of human side of safety and prevention, whereas the wording of the city plan, we'd argue, is quite operational and doesn't really cover the human side of safety. Shall I pause there, or I have a couple of other points? Okay. There's a point under environment and climate change. Obviously, all of this is becoming more of a focus for everybody. The churches, because of the buildings and how they've been built for over many centuries, provide cool spaces in the summer, which is increasingly important, warm spaces in the winter, and dry spaces in extreme weather. Extreme rain has resulted in, for the first time, distressingly, in living memory, that homeless people are suffering from trench foot, since they can't get dry. That doesn't appear, I mean, it's a small but very important detail, doesn't appear in the city plan, or the church's role in providing free, open door for everyone, safe space in the face of weather emergencies. So we'd like the city plan, if possible, to include policy that better reflects evidence of the need for extreme weather shelter, particularly for vulnerable people, and recognises charities, churches, other organisations' role in that provision. So we suggest this is added to point 4 in S2. Shall I continue? And
Just bear with me a second. Okay, continue.
There are a lot of polarized views in the world at the moment. The corporation is doing so much, as well as the diocese, in multi-faith spaces and creating multi-faith spaces and understanding. We feel this is really important to mention in the city plan because there's a lot of hate crime against various religions, and that multi-faith work builds tolerance and understanding between people of different faiths. We met Commander Khan, one of the senior officers in the City of London Police recently, and he said that churches have an important role in safety and can bring communities together. Again, this goes back to the more human side of what a safe city means. So we'd like to see more in this matter, possibly even an additional policy point in S2 that recognises the importance of building and promoting multi-faith peace and tolerance as a key element in the city plan safety policies. This would include recognising and protecting the role of churches, third sector and voluntary organisations, again, not just about the churches, and the City of London Police and other statutory provision in providing spaces to do this vital work and recognising it as a priority in the development of the safety in the city. And there's one very final point, which I might just cover as well. So one small specific amendment in SA2 dispersal routes would be that churches be added to the following sentence: reduce the instances of noise, nuisance and antisocial behaviour, particularly in residential areas and near noise sensitive uses and developments such as health facilities, schools, and the addition of church buildings in that sentence, if possible.
Mr. McNichol.
Thank you very much. I think all important points. I suppose on a number of these matters, it feels to me like the plan isn't necessarily the place to achieve some of these. I think the role of charities, third sector, and other agencies in supporting safety is absolutely recognised and is really vital. And I don't think in any way we'd want to undermine that or give any indication that we didn't recognise that really important role. But I'm not sure that the plan itself is a place to spell that out, or is a mechanism through which to encourage further work in that regard. in terms of providing safe spaces and particularly the need for extreme weather shelter, we do have a mention around the provision of cool spaces, albeit that's in relation to hotels and the opportunities for those sorts of spaces of shelter. I'm not sure off the top of my head that we have another place that we could potentially look at. But I think we recognise that there is a need for spaces within the city to provide places of respite, particularly during moments of extreme weather and extreme temperatures. So I'll have a quick look at that and see if there's something that could be referenced there. And I think, again, in terms of building multi-faith tolerance, absolutely vital work for all of us. But again, I'm not sure that the plan itself is the place to be necessarily talking about how we would achieve that. It feels like more of a community-based project, something that we could bring people together to achieve, but less related to development in the square mile. In terms of SA2 and recognising churches as noise-sensitive uses, I think there are a few places where we have, maybe even only 2 places where we've referenced noise-sensitive uses and given examples. We could certainly have a look at that and just make sure that we are giving consistent examples. And we certainly recognise that places of worship are a noise-sensitive use. So I think that's certainly something we could have a look at, whether it's in this particular policy or in the supporting text. But yeah, absolutely. I think there's a recognition that churches have that noise sensitivity to a lot of different aspects of what we do.
Thanks. I think just one point on the changes in climate. I think given the lifespan of the city plan, it is worth really underlining that it'll get much hotter and much wetter, and provision will be needed for spaces for people who aren't city workers and therefore don't have the luxury of air conditioning. And the wet weather is going to be a really big problem for the most vulnerable people. So I think that just needs to be said.
Are the requirements for a safe and secure city set out in policies S2 and SA1 to SA3 positively prepared in a way that is aspirational but deliverable?
Yes, the policies in the city plan relating to safety and security are positively prepared in a way that is aspirational and deliverable. The policies in this chapter of the plan are aspirational in that they recognise the particular threats to safety and security that the city faces and the design solutions required to mitigate this threat in an internationally significant location. Safe and secure strategic policy S2 sets out a high-level vision for buildings and public realm to be safe and secure in terms of crime, fear of crime, public safety, antisocial behaviour and terrorism. This vision is clearly expressed through the practical advice in city plan policies SA 1, 2 and 3, which require risk assessments and management and design and access statements to be produced. City plan policies are expected to result in area-wide security measures to ensure that businesses, workers, residents and visitors in this high-growth area are protected by implementing measures such as dispersal routes, emergency clearance in pedestrian areas and emergency planning procedures as set out in policy S2. The safe and secure policies are expected to result in the delivery of developments and public realm schemes that ensure the city is safe and secure.
I've read all your comments and I've read the statements. I don't need to hear any more of this. Just finally, are the policies clearly defined and unambiguous so that it is evident how a decision maker should react to development proposals?
Yes, the policies are clearly defined and unambiguous in accordance with NPPF paragraph 16, which requires clearly written and unambiguous policies which are drafted so that it is evident how a decision maker should react to development proposals. Policy SA2 helps to ensure that the measures contained in the required management statements are appropriate to local circumstances. For example, restricted licensing hours, regulation of servicing vehicles and issuing of table and chair licenses. The assessment of the management statements will have regard to the City of London noise strategy, the provisions of the City of London Statement of Licensing Policy and any submitted licence application operating schedule.
Further questions? Everything's clear. Mr. Peacock?
Sorry, just one follow-up question, if I may, from what Mr. McNichol said about this, I guess, the human aspect of safety and the multi-agency, multi-faith dimension of it not being necessarily appropriate for the city plan, but you said there could be other places that it would be better placed, and it would be good to get guidance at some point to know where we should push those doors, please.
Yeah, very happy to have that conversation.
Okay, you'll be glad to know you've heard enough from me today. So I shall give you a quick 5 minutes to swap around. So if there's anybody who needs to take a seat at the table or anyone that wants to leave that isn't staying for main matter 12, then Mr. Phillips will take main matter 12. Oh, Mr. Hart.
So I did mention this morning that there are a couple of matters which have been flagged previously in respect of residential amenity in relation to other policies in the plan, but which the association understood we could address today. They have been touched on in other sessions, but I just wanted to raise that if possible, we would appreciate just being able to reiterate those points in relation to matters of residential amenity. I think it's 3 points essentially that I don't know, and I just wanted to make clear before you passed over the baton as to who was the appropriate person sort of speak to it.
It's probably all in one swoop. So yeah, so fire away. I don't think there's a problem with that.
They have been flagged up, so I hope they won't come as any surprise. So the first 2 points relate to policy HS3, and in particular the reference to cumulative impacts in that policy. It's the point raised by Ms. Smith during the relevant session, and so and I've watched the session back. But the fundamental concern that the association has about the wording of policy at HS3 is that it is not clear what the word cumulative means in criterion 3 of the policy. And the concern underlying the association's issue with the policy is that cumulative can be taken to mean developments on different sites coming forward at the same time, all of which need to be taken into account in determination of the merits of a particular planning application. But actually what one finds when one lives in the city is that there is successive cumulative development of a single site or sites in the vicinity of residential dwellings, and that successive developments on the same site can have a cumulative impact on residential amenity. And so if one looks at the association's Regulation 19 consultation response, some specific wording was put forward as to how the policy could be amended. So you expressed the concern that it might not be appropriate to, for example, set a baseline for the plan because different areas of the city, it may be appropriate for different areas of the city to be treated differently, and that it wasn't necessarily appropriate to define cumulative any more definitely than simply by reference to its ordinary meaning. The point that I would want to make is we would ask that it's clarified in the plan that cumulative impacts aren't limited to a spatial definition of cumulative, and that it should be made clear whether within the policy or the reason justification that cumulative impacts can arise through the successive development of individual sites or sites within a locality. And as I've already said, we say that's necessary because there can often be a lot of development in a short space of time, but not necessarily all coming forward at the same time. And unless one takes into account development that has recently occurred within the locality, one isn't going to capture the full effect of development, we say, at a development management stage. So we're just looking for some recognition that cumulative impacts are also impacts which can arise in time as opposed to simply spatially. That's the first point. I don't know if you want to take me to take each of the points in turn, or if you want me to speak for all of them.
I think the way you've explained it is it's quite reasonable, it's quite rational, but trying to put that into a policy to how you capture that, I'm of the view that's simple in the meaning of cumulative. It means it's a, to use the term church, it's a broad church, isn't it? So if you are concerned about if you're concerned about development, the cumulative impact of other developments, whether they be on that site or on adjacent sites, whether they've come in a rapid period of time, or whether there's been an incremental erosion of living conditions, for example, or then I think you can make that argument within that policy, can't you? I think it's about making those representations because it's not fettering what cumulative means. You're using the dictionary definition. I would suggest. I think, and I think we did have this discussion, didn't we, Mr. McNichol, about the use of cumulative, and I've been to bed since then, and I haven't watched myself back because I don't make very good television, I don't think so. I don't know how you can frame it in any other way that allows you that flexibility to not set these, because I think again it's this thing, if you try and focus it too much and try and define it too much, then actually causing yourselves problems if you want to make representations. Whereas you can say that we live the area which you represent, Reverend Jorgensen, we live in this specific area of the city. We've had these developments not just over the past year and a half. This has been 10 years, and what the impacts are this has had an impact. I'm making things up now, but you could say it's had an impact on the availability of play space. It's had an impact in terms of the because these are commercial. Say for example, these are commercial nature. The vehicle movements. This has had this cumulative and this incremental impact. So you're not defining it to a particular timescale. You're not particularly defining it to it's a specific area because, for example, you may have noise or amenity use and amenity impacting uses that maybe are on the periphery of, say, the Golden Lane estate or the Barbican. So it's a danger of just trying, because these are quite high level policies. It's full, the devil's in the detail of the planning proposals. Now, absolutely, we sit in these local plan examinations. They say, well, that's all well and good, but when I'm sitting opposite the development management officer and I'm trying to explain that to them, they're not listening to me. And I think that's and I can understand the frustration. But I think if you try and tighten these things down too much, I think you cause yourselves more of a problem than leaving it quite broad. And I should imagine in your profession as counsel, you would, in some ways, that allows you more scope to make that argument, and either way. So I think it's that sort of balance, isn't it? I don't know whether the corporation has a view on that.
I understand. If I can just come briefly back before Mr. Minick, I hear everything you say, sir, but just because it is a very important point for the association and other residents, I hear exactly what you say about trying to define too precisely what is meant by cumulative, and I hear what you say about that. What I'm proposing is not to try and tie down the definition in any way, shape or form, but to make it clear that cumulative impacts may encompass a range of different cumulative impacts, and to try and provide examples of what those might be. So one is almost doing the opposite of tying down the definition of the word cumulative. One is making clear that may encompass a range of different impacts. And the reason why I'm trying to press this point and I have heard what you said. The reason why I'm trying to press this point is because the association's real fear is that cumulative will be interpreted to mean simply, if you've got 3 developments coming forward at the same time, then in determining the merits of those applications, one simply takes into account those 3 developments and nothing else. So, as you'll be aware, the reason justification for a policy can be an aid to interpretation of the policy if it comes to trying to understand what the policy means. And so we say, if it is the corporation's understanding that cumulative is this sort of broad church and can have a number of different meanings, then including something by way of explanation within the reason justification would assist in giving that understanding and that interpretation to the word cumulative, and absolutely not tying it down, but just providing an aid to decision makers to make clear that they can take into account, for example, in a given circumstance, recent developments, successive developments of sites in a particular vicinity. So I just want to make sure that I was absolutely clear on what we were saying, what we weren't saying, because it isn't that we're trying to tie the word cumulative down to a particular thing that would catch us out later on. That's not what we're sort of saying to you now. So, yeah.
Mr. McNichol.
Thank you very much. I think we have to be cautious here, and that there is a risk of suggesting that cumulative impacts can be, the layers of development that have happened over longer or shorter periods of time. The city is a place that changes, and the city is a place that, generally speaking, grows. We recognise that does, of course, have implications for all of the city's communities, but it is part of the nature of not just the square mile, but all urban places, that they do have that tendency to grow and to change. I would be wary of sort of being more specific than we are here. And generally, the aim of the policy is to really consider the cumulative impacts of proposals that are coming forward at the same time, but it does give flexibility for decision makers, should they wish it, to look at other developments and factor that into their decision making. I think that's a reasonable interpretation of what's said in the policy here. And I'd also point to Chapter 9 of the plan on design, 9.8.2, where we have made quite clear statements about really practical aspects of considering daylight and sunlight. The City Corporation will take into account unusual existing circumstances, such as development on an open or low-rise site, as well as the presence of balconies and other external features which limit the daylight and sunlight the building can receive, and so forth. And I think that is those sorts of changes are things that the association have been pressing for. I think the policy there, DE7, gives really clear guidance on daylight and sunlight, and I think this approach here gives us the appropriate level of flexibility within policy HS3 as well. Thank you.
So if you'll indulge me, just a very brief response to what Ms. McNichol said. By making the amendment that we're proposing, we're absolutely not tying the corporation to take into account a planning permission that was granted 20 years ago. We're not suggesting that one should be tied down to a definition of what cumulative means. But again, it's just a question of ensuring that when decision makers come to look at the policy, they understand that cumulative effects might happen over time, as well as spatially, and decision makers will need to exercise a judgment as to what an appropriate period of time would be to take that into account. Insofar as Ms. McNichol was saying, well, the policy is primarily directed towards developments coming forward at the same time, the association does have a clear problem with that, because that doesn't account for cumulative impacts of development within the city. It's not simply a question of 2 or 3 developments coming forward at the same time. As Mr. McNichol said, development comes forward in the city constantly, and therefore one needs to have a temporal understanding of cumulative impacts as well as a spatial one. So the second point he made, we'd say, would reinforce the need for some clarity as to what cumulative means to reflect what I had understood, you had understood cumulative to mean, which might encompass temporal effects. So, yeah. Sorry, so Ms. Smith would like to just briefly add something.
Just quote what Mr. McNichols just said back to it, which he said the intention is that it's developments that come at the same time, but that it doesn't constrain a decision maker to think of other aspects of cumulative. But if that's the intention, it needs to say that it doesn't constrain. What's the problem with saying that's the intention, but it shouldn't constrain a decision making and looking at other aspects cumulative? Because at the moment they'll read the intention and they may not read but it won't constrain you from considering other aspects. It's Mr. Jameson's point. Sorry, Mr. Bridgewater's point. Thank you, pardon.
I'm the man with 3 surnames, so I really wouldn't worry about it. So, the cumulative impact of planning applications for individual developments on the amenity of existing residents will be considered. Doesn't say the timescale of those planning applications, does it? It doesn't set a parameter. I've got Mr. McNichol. You'll have to ask him, but just wait. See, I think if you tighten it and if you try and define it any more, I think the only people will do well out of this is lawyers, to be honest, because I think is it an open list? Is it a closed list? Should the examples or the scenarios, whereas cumulative allows you, say you're concerned about a development that says, well, yes, it says cumulative. It doesn't set it over a time period. We're not defining a time period. Actually, when you built that office block next to the Barbican back in 1990, there was issues in regards to, I don't know, sort of overshadowing reflections, blah, 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 blah. Now, subsequently, we've had that, and actually some of that's mitigated that, but actually we've still got this. We've had an increase of traffic. That proposal in 2010 means that actually that's quite intensively serviced. You can. I'm not trying to encourage you to submit objections to planning applications, but what I'm saying to you is it gives you the opportunity to tell your story, unconstrained. Now, the other thing is, I will say, and it's probably less likely to happen here than elsewhere in the country, but often these cumulative impacts, the number of Section 78 inquiries that we sit at, not so many now because we predominantly do local plans, but when we do that, people who come forward with the cumulative impacts, the people have just moved into the new houses on the edge of the town or the edge of the village, and say, well, it's having a cumulative impact. You've only been in that house a year and a half. Where's the cumulative? So there is that. Now, obviously, these are small residential pockets within an area that is predominantly commercial. You feel very sensitive. I can understand there's a sensitivity, and actually, I absolutely understand that. But the key with policies is not make them too prescriptive, not make them too complicated, and I absolutely agree. Yeah. No, you don't have to shut up. This is what we're here.
It's about developments coming together at the same time, and it doesn't say anything else. Then he will tell his colleagues that, and that's what the decision maker will think.
And Mr. Parker, as your counsel, will say, but that's not what the policy says, is it? Is that correct?
Well, I think for the purpose of today's issues, what I
let-
would
let-
say is we have an opportunity now to make the policy clear that so that you know,
Do you not see the danger in what I'm suggesting then?
I see a danger if we were to try and define what cumulative meant exhaustively, then I can see the danger. But I think what the association are proposing is not an exhaustive definition, but simply to make clear that what might otherwise be interpreted as the meaning of cumulative, and one possible interpretation of cumulative, that's to say three developments coming forward at the same time, that's not what it is meant by cumulative, because I think that's the concern. I know you.
But that's not what the policy says, does it? So I'm asking you now, you separate yourself from, obviously I understand you are being instructed and you have to represent. I'm asking you now, because you're all here to help myself and Mr. Phillips. If Mr. McNichol, and I've not given the opportunity to respond, but if he had said, oh no, this only applies to three, if you put, you know, applications that are coming in at the same time, the cumulative impact, what would you say to him based on point 3 of policy HS3?
Well,
honestly.
Honestly, I would say that's a reasonable interpretation of that policy. There's a lack of clarity in the policy. Cumulative might mean developments coming forward at the same time, or it might mean something else. I think that there is a genuine lack of clarity as to what cumulative means, and I mean, you may not agree with me, but that I think is the concern. And insofar as there's any lack of clarity, that the time to try and resolve that issue is now, when you're setting your parameters for the way in which the plan is to be interpreted. So if you have the opportunity to provide some clarity without being restrictive, and I'll again reiterate, it's not about being restrictive or exhaustive, then we would say that opportunity should be taken up, and you know, that is how the plan works. We've heard today, you've got the policies, and then you've got the way it works in the reason justification, and so it's not uncommon for there to be tightly drawn policies with some explanation as to how they work in the reason justification. So I don't think what we're suggesting is particularly controversial in sort of its principle. Yeah.
Mr. McNichol.
Thank you very much. Perhaps it's helpful to clarify. I mean, certainly, as I said earlier, the principal objective of this aspect of the policy is to be able to consider applications that are coming forward at the same time. That's really important, where you have multiple applications, some of which, you know, one of which may have been granted already, others are coming forward later on to that, so that you're not looking at schemes in isolation when they're affecting residential amenity. I think the danger of starting to unravel that, or sorry, I should rephrase that. The danger of starting to give anything more specific in terms of the situations in which a decision maker might consider extant buildings is, to my mind, that would be a really exceptional thing to be doing, and we'd have to look at exactly what scenarios might or might not be the case, might not be appropriate for that to be exceptional. And B, it does mean that we're then sort of going into quite a lot of detail within the policy or the wording of the policy to set out these are the sorts of situations where one would conceivably achieve this. It feels to me that's best left to decision makers to be able to use their discretion. But as I say, the principal reasoning here of having this in the policy is to be able to consider multiple applications that are coming forward that are live and ones that have been permitted, so that you can make sure you're not looking at them purely in isolation. I hope that's at least clear.
Yeah, I come from a long history. I'm a development management planner by background. So I come from a long history of interpreting the policies that the likes of Mr. McNichol and Mr. Hutchins at Wandsworth and you know, etc. have come up and the councils have come up with. So in terms of how I would approach this as a decision maker, I would say, so if you raised an issue, you'd say, look, this, say we're looking at, we'll talk about daylighting and overshadowing, because that is probably one of the things that does concern the group. So even if there is existing buildings that have been there since the 1950s or 60s, or you've got large towers, say they were designed in such a way to allow light penetration into those, into the inner part of a site, or to make sure that the sun path was respected and there was reasonable daylighting and whatever. If a new scheme came forward either in isolation or as part of 2 or 3, and actually by adding those new buildings to that existing landscape, the cumulative effect of the existing scenario plus those, you would have to consider, wouldn't you? You would do it naturally I would do it naturally, and I think most development managers would do it naturally as their assessment of the planning application, and it would be the cumulative impact. So you actually say, well, yeah, we understand there's an issue here. You know, there's an issue here because if you put those buildings there at that height, then obviously what natural light was coming in, or the relief from overshadowing is now lost, and it's the cumulative impact of the buildings that were there in the 60s or the 50s allied to the buildings that we're bringing forward in 2025, 2026. Whereas if you just try and narrow it, you know, if you try and narrow it down, or you try and, you know, I can understand you want the decision maker to look at, because obviously schemes come forward in the City of London, there's come, you know, 2 or 3 will come forward at once, won't they? They're all right, we're up. So I should imagine it's like a starting pistol, isn't it? I should imagine if one person sees an opportunity, other people will see the opportunity as well. So I think it can work. I think it can work both ways. But I've got a real fear that if you start fiddling with it or trying to provide more explanation, I think you've lost that opportunity. Because I think naturally, when you're considering amenity or living conditions, or you're considering character and appearance, because it might be a character and appearance scenario, might impact on the skyline, or you know, reasonable views through, or something like that. It's that cumulative impact, isn't it? So I think that works, and I think there's a danger in I absolutely hear what the residents say about that cumulative impact, but I think sometimes it's about formulating the way you engage, you know, you rehearse your concerns. So I think it's about how you do that, and obviously I understand this isn't something. The more you try and deal with individual, it's almost like whack-a-mole, isn't it? You try and sort something out, but you'll have I think by fiddling with this, that 0.3, I think you'll have unintended consequences, because I think then even if you've got a series of examples, then it gives lawyers something else to argue about. Whereas if you just say it's cumulative, it's not saying whether it's cumulative from, you know, 3 applications together, or you know, it's not setting that, and it allows you then to make your representations, and it allows the decision maker to make that assessment. And I think there's a real danger in, and I'm you know, I've not heard enough to convince me to change that, because I think we'll end up tying ourselves in knots. And actually, I think it'd have a detrimental impact on the ability of people like the Barbican Golden Lane Association, your community, should they so wish to comment on, you know, planning proposals, to be able to make that argument. And I think it goes wider than just overshadowing. It's traffic and things like that. So I think you're best in terms of cumulative, leave it as the dictionary says, gives you it is a broad church, and you can make those arguments and those representations. And the key as well is to, when you're making those representations, to clearly explain what the issues are, to try and structure it in terms of this, you know, these proposals will ally to the existing buildings, we consider will result in X, Y, Z, and we've noted the mitigation. However, so I think there's a real danger. I don't think there's a case being made for doing that, and I think even if I can understand why, because I think that's more frustrations with the system rather than the application of the policy and the ability to do that. But I think some of the key things is how you make your representations be very clear.
So I'm not going to come back to you. It's a point that follows on from that. Obviously, you've heard what we've said, and it's a significant concern for the association. I've heard everything that you've said and the justification for it. You've heard what Mr. McNichols says. And I'm not. You will need to come to write your report in due course. I suppose the request that I would put in is for you to provide reasons in that report why you're rejecting the complaints that we've made about that policy, because everything you've just said is very helpful in terms of, you know, the definition of cumulative being a broad church. So I'm not telling you how to write your report, but I suppose that I'm putting in a respectful request that the things that you've said are the reasons why you don't accept what we're saying, and you know, that's clear and understandable, and just a request that finds its way into the report, because I think that would be helpful.
Mr. Rogers?
Sorry, could I just add something to what you just said? As far as the schemes coming together, in objecting to one scheme by referring to an oncoming scheme, we've been told that's irrelevant. The scheme we're considering is the scheme that's here. What may come forward next is nothing to do with us today. And that's the problem we have with the cumulative effect.
Yeah, I absolutely understand that, and I understand it's frustrating. And obviously, you probably are sort of living in a city so dynamic. I should imagine you are aware of things coming forward because the developers will be notifying. But I think you could be very clear in writing your responses to any planning proposal to say that, you know, it's important you give license because it's no secret, and providing the background information. I think it's quite important. The officers are quite clear that obviously they need to be aware of dealing with things in the here and now. But it does, you know, they will. I shouldn't imagine the City of London approve every planning application. I don't think they do, because I think if you read the planning press and the construction press, there are a number of appeals that I know colleagues are sitting in a number of inquiries in the City of London. So clearly they you know, the planning authority here does apply strict standards and seek to protect the environment. But obviously it's well, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Sorry, unless Mr. Mitchell wants to come back on it, there are a couple more points. I'm going to try and take them more quickly because I'm conscious that your session's being derailed. They all relate to light and visual amenity. There are 3 points that I want to make. I think one of them is being flagged up. Firstly, light spill at night affects residential amenity. I think Ms. Smith made the point in respect of the design policies, policy DE7 in particular, that there should be an additional requirement for automated blinds in new development. That's a measure which I understand has been implemented, as it were, voluntarily in some developments, is very effective at mitigating light spill, and that other policies and systems to mitigate light spill at night have not been effective. So that's the first request. The second request in respect of policy DE7, which is framed by reference to the application of the BRE guidelines, is a request for reference to be made to the need to consider absolute levels of light in addition to simply percentage reductions of levels of light, which the BRE guidelines are based on, and the reasons for that are set out in the written representations. But it's the case that by reason of cumulative development, often you often end up with developments which would comply with the BRE guidelines but result in otherwise very low absolute levels of light because of the baseline situation, which is treated as the baseline for the application of the BRE guidelines, even though in relatively recent history there have been much better levels of light within particular dwellings. And the third point in respect to policy DE7 is a request for there to be a requirement for a residential visual amenity assessment, or at least consideration given to the need for a residential visual amenity assessment to protect the visual amenity of residents. Again, just justification for that is set out in the Reg 19 representations. But those are the other sort of residential amenity points which I know have been flagged up. They come from other sessions, so thank you for listening.
Right, should we take a short break? And then you'll hear the last of me now, so, okay. So we'll have 10 minutes, but back at 3 o'clock, and then obviously anybody who wants to leave after this session are more than welcome to go. So it's just main matters 12 for the rest of today.